Have you ever wondered what would have happened if India became independent in 1947, but there was no rulebook to run the country? Think about the situation at that time. A newly independent nation, more than 350 million people, hundreds of princely states, many religions, many languages, and centuries of colonial rule suddenly coming to an end. If there was no common framework to guide the country, confusion and conflict would have been inevitable. This is exactly why India needed a constitution. Welcome to PS Choudhary. In this lecture, let us clearly understand the making of the Indian constitution, starting with a very basic but important question: why did India need a constitution in the first place? Now, let us understand the situation in 1947. India had just gained independence after nearly 2 centuries of British rule. At that time, the country was not a single unified political unit. Along with British Indian provinces, there were more than 500 princely states. These princely states had their own rulers and different administrative systems. At the same time, India was extremely diverse. There were more than 14 major languages, numerous communities, different religions, and very different regional interests. So imagine this situation. A massive and diverse country suddenly becomes independent. Without a common framework of rules, there would be no clarity about how the government should function, what powers it should have, and what limits it must follow. That is why a constitution became absolutely necessary. Now let us understand what exactly a constitution does. A constitution performs 3 very important functions. First, it tells us how the government of the country will be organized. In other words, it defines the structure of government. It explains the roles of the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. It also tells us how power is divided between the union government and the states. Second, a constitution tells us what the government cannot do to its citizens. This is where rights become important. The constitution protects the basic freedoms and liberties of people. It ensures that the government cannot act arbitrarily against individuals. You might have heard about fundamental rights. These rights exist precisely to protect citizens from misuse of power. Third, the Constitution clearly states who the government must ultimately serve. And the answer is very simple: the people. In a democracy like India, the Constitution establishes that sovereignty ultimately lies with the people. The government is not above the citizens. Instead, it functions on behalf of the citizens. Now, this is a very important point for UPSC. Understanding why India needed a constitution helps you understand many features of the constitution itself. For example, why did India adopt federalism with a strong center? Why were fundamental rights included? Why were directive principles introduced? When you understand the historical circumstances, these features start making much more sense. This background is also important from the examination perspective. In the preliminary examination, questions are rarely asked directly from this conceptual background. However, the examiner often expects you to understand this context while answering questions related to Government of India Acts or the Constituent Assembly. In the mains examination, especially in General Studies Paper 2, questions can be asked in a broader analytical way. For example, the examiner may ask you to examine the circumstances that led to the making of the Indian Constitution. In such answers, you are expected to discuss 3 key aspects. First, the colonial legacy left by British rule. Second, the aspirations of the Indian nationalist movement. And third, the vision expressed in the objectives resolution. So remember this clearly. The making of the Indian Constitution was not just a legal exercise. It was a response to India's historical circumstances, political struggles, and democratic aspirations. Let us quickly revise the key ideas. First, India needed a constitution because the country was extremely diverse and newly independent, and it required a common framework to govern itself. Second, a constitution performs 3 core functions. It defines how the government is organized, it protects the rights of citizens, and it establishes that the government serves the people. Third, understanding this background is very useful for UPSC, especially for writing better analytical answers in the mains examination. In the next part, we will move forward and understand the historical background of the Constitution, particularly the British constitutional acts that gradually shaped India's constitutional development.